I can't.
Mm.
Yeah. Anyway, let's get going. I think it's just us. It's a discussion between friends now. So let's try to uh, go through with these things and at least exchange some ideas.
Yeah.
So just for your Juan Ricardo Ortega, he's now in Bogota Energy Group.
Yeah, I'm the CEO of a large multi-Latina utility.
But he used to head the tax administration in Colombia. Before that, he was heading the Bogota City as the Secretary of Finance. And so that's the experience that we wanted him to draw upon for this discussion on property tax and its implementation in Bogota. So this is the detailed slide, right? For him? Okay. So why don't we go ahead?
Yeah, why don't we introduce each other? So
Yeah.
Sure.
Yes. Many, so I'm more than happy if I can adjust whatever I'm going to be presenting to something that is of your particular interest, that will make it the most useful.
Yes, I'll start. So I'm Taiwo. I'm the head of the Fiscal Reform Commission for Nigeria.
Okay.
So we're doing a lot of work in trying to get, just get things right. And this is one of the big items for the sub-national government.
Yeah.
And the World Bank has been very helpful over the past couple of years in helping us develop some, image to create a register. And now we need to take that forward to see how do you use that for land development, economic planning, and also to collect taxes.
Yeah.
Because what we collect currently is less than 0.3% of GDP from corporate taxes. We think we can do 3 times within the next 3 years.
Yeah.
So it would be great to learn from your experience. So
yeah.
Pleasure to be here.
Well, so it will be my pleasure. I'll briefly let you know a little bit of who I am, so you get a little bit of context. My education is mostly in finance. I'm usually pretty good with numbers. And I became the Secretary of Finance of the city of Bogota. The city had just attempted to have a cadastral appraisal update, and it was a major disaster. People get extremely upset when taxes increase, particularly when they cannot afford them. And there were huge protests, and they make some significant mistakes, particularly with people with a lot of political influence, like the commercial malls. No? And that's one of the particulars that might be of your interest. Now, when you use the techniques that have been introduced in most of these institutions, you usually value the land, you value the property, you come up with a number. But when you are talking about common ownership, like a commercial mall, and you want to split the amount of tax, then you can really run into trouble. So I will try to give you some of the details of what we learned. But everything that is a common property is of particular interest because of all the complexities that can arise. And the other big issue that we learned is that you have to really keep in mind if you are going to get into people's pockets. If you are going to be forcing people to rebalance their consumption basket, you're going to get in trouble. You want to look at the marginal income, whatever increase in income, and you can appropriate that. You can find ways to increase taxation based on people's additional income. But on current income, where people have already plans for whatever, education, housing, is extremely risky if you don't take that into account. So what made the whole process successful is that we realized which segments of the population had the most difficulty with increasing the tax, and we literally divorced the appraisals from the tax and made sure that the tax is something people could pay, and the appraisal was something that was current for people to be able to use it as a collateral or whatever for them to understand their wealth. But the wealth is different than the income. So we were very careful of looking at those two things separately. And in income, you go for obviously the high level consumption, high level income. And on those, you apply the pressure immediately, which is a significant source of collection. But for the majority, you are very cautious in doing things gradually. So those would be like the 2 main takeaways if you want me to be brief about what I will present. So that's what I want to show. You know? Like, how can we look at the two things separately? First, I'll let you see a little bit of what Bogota is. No? Bogota is a large city, but nothing like Lagos. So, in that sense, for you, these are tiny numbers. Is 2.5 properties, 2.5 million properties. A little bit of them rural, just on the surroundings of the city. This is the capital of Colombia. It's a pretty dense city. It's 287 million square meters of built area. And today's appraisal is $178 billion. And the tax is, it has brackets. So the really wealthy that has unused properties can go up to 3%, but most of the people that is wealthy is around 1%, and then it goes down. And people that has houses that are $5,000, which are literally is extremely poor, they pay the tax because it allows them to show that they are the ones using that property and they can guarantee their property rights through the information of their tax paying. So we make sure that the tax base is extremely broad, everybody pays, but the poor people pays very little. And we make sure that you allow them to realize that most of the money will go into those communities for public lining, parks, infrastructure. So people, where you have extreme poverty, they know this is something that really pays out. Not just because it is a proof of property rights, but because money will be coming to them in a much larger figure than what they are paying for. Collecting wise, those poor segments of society, you are actually losing money. The cost of collecting is higher than what they pay. But we have the strong belief that people's participation in the process, it creates pressure on the whole society to be accountable on paying the property tax. And the property tax is not on the people, but on the dwelling. That is something on the legislation that really matters, because you can take actions on the dwelling indifferently of who the owner is. So if there is a transaction of property and there are unpaid taxes, whomever is buying the property is going to be accountable for the unpaid taxes. So we follow the property and we're very aggressive on making sure that you pay to the point that the properties might be taken by the government and sold out in an auction. And you do that in a very visual way for everybody to realize this is serious. So you don't really want to mess around with the tax administration. So we were very careful in choosing the places that were going to be expropriated because on paid taxes, and we made it on weekends where people were going to church, in places that were visible to people, and you would put huge boards saying this property is being expropriated for not paying their property taxes. So all demonstrations that we could make that for everybody to see and realize that this is something that has that there is not much of a gaining power if you don't pay your taxes. We really put a lot of emphasis on that. But being very strategic. You don't want to do many expropriations. It's a mess. It's extremely hard to administer. But the few ones you do, you choose them extremely carefully to make them as much of an advertisement that you can. No? So like if it is a store in the corner that everybody uses and they don't pay, you go for that. You don't go for a grandmother whose husband died. No? That's something you have to be extremely cautious. Those things happen. No?
Yeah.
We had an athlete that became paralytic and he couldn't pay his taxes and he had huge undue taxes, and we have to find a way to solve those. And we created some specific legislation for those cases where people are under extreme duress to find ways out. Like those are the ones that kill you. If you get the wrong people in the media, that's the end of the whole process.
It's interesting that you mentioned that, if you don't mind.
No?
So I was speaking to one of the head of internal revenue service in one of our states in Nigeria just last week. On those states, and exactly what you said now happened. So they had done the assessments. Nobody was forthcoming for this property. So they took the matter to the land tribunal. Nobody showed up. So they levied the decision. And then went there to execute the decision. And then they met a woman, an old woman who had lost the husband and was half paralyzed, couldn't even work. So the head of the unit said to me that it was so bad, he had to use his money to pay the tax. So they can't expropriate the assets.
Yeah.
So, and then they had to put that information in their database, because what you're saying now, they should have done before they went to the tribunal, which they did not do. So this is actually real, what you're saying now.
Those are the cases that can heal this whole process.
Yeah.
And it's one that you need. So you have to really come up with wording in the legislation and a mechanism for like a so-called tribunal to assess those cases and find ways out. And it has to be discretional, but you have to make sure there is a lot of documentary base so people don't begin to abuse, because this is literally a way out. And you have to have a very tiny window, but to make sure that all the key cases, you can bring them there. So drafting the legislation on that little aspect that doesn't seem that relevant ends up being, in our case, extremely sensitive to make things, you can really have a strong tax base and a cadastre that can work almost automatically, because this nowadays, this works like a machine, like you don't have to do the appraisals anymore. Everything has been already embedded into an automatic process. But this is what we did, and that annual updating, that is something that would take almost a decade for people to do a new appraisal, and it was an extremely expensive, like $5 million investment, and just bring a lot of people all throughout the city to do the appraisals. That is extremely risky. So what we designed was a mechanism that you were on top of all transactions and update the system automatically on a year basis without ever doing a big appraisal again, because that is almost scandalous. Everybody feels like, oh my God, they're going to change the tax base. So we made it in something that is as an automatic process within the institution of cadastre based on data. And with today's databases and artificial intelligence, what you can do is absolutely amazing. You just need to put together the processes. So the tradition of looking at value at just land and the square meter being built, which is the base, and splitting the city on what they call homogeneous physical zones and geoeconomic homogeneous zones based on the distance to schools, to parks, to transportation. That is something that you have to build into the econometric models. And that modeling part took a lot of effort. We brought people even from top US universities to come up with models. The more sophisticated models didn't work that well after all. But we build them because you need to have the credibility that you've gone through the whole process of coming up with the best way to estimate based on the data you can collect. And that is the big question: how much data and how you can collect it? How can you make that into models that provide information that interpolates for all the assets that have not been transacted and you don't have current information? And that works for like the big numbers, that works for the majority of housing. But for the very poor, and particularly for the very rich, that is useless. And that's the discussion now in Bogota. And I'm still part of the city administration in a way, and the woman that is leading cadastre, someone that worked with me. So I'm actually helping her. So at the end, I will show you our ideas. It's something that we haven't implemented it yet, but I'm spending some of my time trying to come up with ways, because the tax levels of the very, very wealthy are really way out of the market, because the market doesn't provide any information on the very wealthy. So what you could call luxurious housing has to be a chapter on its own, that there is no model that can measure the value of those assets. And having access to data is extremely challenging. You have to begin to talk to Sotheby's and like all these big auction houses, because they are the ones that transact those kind of houses, even in a country like Colombia, because it's so expensive that there is no market broker that can address that kind of people. There are $5 million, $6 million houses in Bogota, which for everybody's income is insane. Like for people in cadastre, they cannot even imagine there is a house that expensive. So your people cannot assess that kind of housing because it is way out of anybody's experience. But there is a lot of money to be collected there. So coming up with ways, and that is what makes the whole process more legitimate. If you can show people that there are extremely wealthy people, which in Lagos for sure there are.
Yes.
Yeah.
And you can show the value of the pool, the value of the garden, the value of the kitchen. There are kitchens in Bogota. I do this as a hobby. It's kind of some of disease after you run taxes administration, you get some weird behavior. So I go into luxury stores and look for like how somebody with a lot of money would live. And you get $300,000 kitchens. Yeah, $300,000 is almost everybody's house.
Yes.
Yeah. And having a kitchen that is just 300,000 and baths and marbles, those details become extremely critical for the evaluation of luxury houses. And if not, you're never going to get the value. And the value of the construction doesn't say much. Because when you're luxurious and you're very wealthy, it's the volume of the house, it's not the square meters of the house. So you have to come up with new ways, particularly for that segment, and it really pays out. And at the end, I will tell you a little bit about it. There is literature about using drones, and that has to be enacted in the legislation. And I do believe it's the only way, because very wealthy people would never let you into their premises. Now, that's part of their security, and they will have 1,000 arguments to block anybody using them for the cadastre. And you would get pretty confused when you see that level of wealth. So if you can come up with means that you can use drones, and you have to let people know when the drone is going to make sure nobody's there. You cannot end up with a picture of somebody walking naked out of the shower. So it's a total disaster for the process. So you have to make sure that you let them know at what time. The drone has to have some big labels that says this is cadastre, you're going to have information of the pictures before anybody. If there is a picture that you think it violates your privacy, it will be deleted. If you don't come up with a protocol that is extremely cautious on people's privacy, they will undermine the possibility of being able to have a faithful assessment of those households. And those households, without understanding the kitchens, the bathrooms, the materials, it's very hard to assess the real market value, because that's where a lot of the wealth is on all the quality of the woods, the quality of the closets. That stuff is extremely expensive when you are looking at the high end. And training people for that would really matter, because it's a small segment, but it can be 10% of your collection. And it's what makes the whole process legitimate. No? In Italy, they have particularly chapters on this, and they have spent a lot of thought on how to look at luxurious housing. But I think the Italians are the ones that are most advanced, probably who knows more about it than I do. So what we began to look is market information. No, I was close to the financial system, given that I'm a financier, and I was previously the head of the FDIC in Colombia. I had access to all the banks, so I got them to give me all the banking information on all loans to either transactions or purchases. And for those loans, the valuations that the banks use. So that became the building block. No? And having all that market comparison is one of the critical databases that we needed to put together and find a way for the banking system to provide that data on a regular basis. It took quite a bit of work from the legal standpoint to guarantee the security of the data and the transparency of how it was going to be used, and storage and the security, all of that needed to be taken care of. And then we look at the rental market as well. And the more traditional ways of the cadastres on the replacement value and the potential development of land, because there is a lot of properties that are being just stored for them to gain value and then develop. Those assets are very critical. For those, we changed the rate of tax. We put extremely high tax rate of like 3.5% to make sure they were forced to sold to the market. So they couldn't withhold properties that would unduly increase the prices of housing. So we began, like as it is written there, finding the sources for the information and finding ways in which we could utilize that information into our different estimates of the value of houses. In some areas of the city, rental is more common than selling the transaction than buying and selling. So we needed to come up with ways and models that through the rental value somehow input a real value of the property. No? And you just have to have the models and validate them. And then, as you see, Bogota has mostly low middle income housing. No? And some of these neighborhoods are extremely dangerous. So trying to come up with appraisals on the ground is a risk to your people, and is very likely won't provide much information that is of any value. So the way you design the process became very critical, because if you come up with the idea that I'm going to be assessing every house like a census, that is shooting yourself in the foot. They're never going to get that done, not get it done well. So what we did is we needed to break a monopoly of the cadastre engineers that are from just one university in the city of Bogota, many of them close to a politician that was extremely corrupt. And they had done the previous cadastre, and we negotiate with people and ask them, if you want me to value your house and undervalue it, just give me some money. So breaking that monopoly, and it's part of the legislation that it has to be validated by a cadastre engineer. We search very carefully for people with that education that were not part of that business, that they had moved on and they had already a real estate a business on their own. And we hired them for them to be the ones signing the assessments, just looking at the end of the process, but not collecting information. And we created a training course where we invited anybody for free. And the best ones were going to be hired as contractors, mostly architects and some engineers. And we trained them on the whole process. And they were the ones that, with the data and with some samples that were very carefully designed, came up with the assessments. And then the engineers signed the documentation to follow all the legal requirements in order to be able to enact the new assessment of the city. But the whole idea was just do this once. When we began in 2009. And once we get it done, we have to move on to something that is automatic. So that's why the models became so critical, and the feeding of the models with accurate market data on a daily basis. And that's how, like, the process of how we came up with the update. So here is kind of like how it worked previously. Like every 10, 15 years, you would have to hire a lot of assessors, and they would go all around the city, and they would ask people to get into their premises and try to come up with an assessment. It was great for politicians because you would hire a lot of people, and those people could make a lot of money, particularly where the houses were valuable, so they could negotiate the value of the assessment. So we found ways to get rid of that, but do it just once. No. Second, there is a lot of discretionality. No? An assessment is always has a lot of room for maneuvering. So how could we make something that is extremely standard, very predictable, something that people can be held accountable, that you can make sure that it was done the right way. So we could have some kind of like homogeneous data to begin with. We didn't want to depend on people so much, and we wanted to have the knowledge within the institution, not to have and hire people around every X time, but it's to make sure that you have a strong institution that has culture, some kind of charisma, like they really care about cadastre and make cadastre not just something about taxation, but as an asset for the city planning, as you just mentioned, just to look at it in a more broader way and make it kind of like the main database for the city's planning process, and trying to get information from the water and sanitation, electricity, telecommunications. We have all the layers of the city map, and to make cadastre that repository of knowledge and understanding of the city as a whole. That for the people in the cadastre really made a difference for them to value the institution as brain and a think tank more than just a tax collecting agency. Tax collection is something that most people don't feel proud about. You have to be a little bit weird if you like that. We needed the collection and the connect and the confidence of the people that have the data to begin to exchange it to us. And that's how we are doing it now. We have very clear objectives. Everything is rule-based, and coming up with the rules took quite a bit of time. The whole process is automatic. Like we found that some people were being paid within cadastre to modify the databases, so they would increase poor people's tax and they would reduce very wealthy people's house value. So coming up with ways in which you would secure the database so those businesses couldn't continue to exist was quite a challenge. So to make sure that all the attributions of have access to the IT, that the IT was going to be checked for malicious, where there were a lot of work trying to clean that up, and firing of the people in the IT department that were utterly corrupt. So that needed to be rebuilt from scratch, literally. And having like these people that knew they were going to be trained to really high levels, and that they had career opportunities. We created some scholarships, and the really top employees would be trained abroad and they would go back to cadastre, and they had a commitment to continue working in the institution. So like people's advancement is something that we work quite a bit on to make sure that we could bring the institution to a more modern and higher level. So we systematized everything. The capture of information became all automatic. People were given these tablets that would use GPS to have the georreferenciación, the geographical reference of where they were taking the information. They were asked to take pictures inside, and they would be providing all the information of the assessment in real time. So we would know where they were and the details of the household they were assessing. So that's to begin the database. And then we update that from that beginning. But the equipment they used at the beginning was absolutely critical because everything was in real time and we could monitor that extremely carefully. And we created a whole system of capturing the data that became the building block that allows us to justify the assessment based on pictures and on different mechanisms that we're using now. And that's extremely useful for you to defend the whole process. And since then, you move on to be able to have continuous assessment with all the information from the city. If there is a premise that is being demolished or is being transformed, we get all that data almost in real time. There are always some aerial pictures that are taken with some intervals that you can use to contrast that with information that you have. And the system is able to detect those kind of modifications. That in Argentina is critical for the development of additional spaces in very wealthy households, like pools or like bars and stuff that they build in their gardens, and most of the people never inform the authorities. When you have aerial pictures, you can see the pools. You have the software that can draft the letter congratulating the owner of the house for the new pool they just built, and the information on how the assessment is going to be changed going forward. So all those little details became part of the automatic process that was developed. Some of it, as I said, based on what we captured originally, and then on the different sources of information, one of them being aerial pictures that are being fed to the IT on a regular basis. And the quality control. You have to be very careful. People, you make mistakes, as in all processes. You have to be very careful that when people ask you to correct the information, because it was not a pool, it was just somebody digging because there was a problem with the sewage. So you have to immediately go back and find a way that you don't screw it up, because then it becomes very costly. So we value 2.5 million households annually in Bogota. So that's a pretty large number. And as I said, it's all based on whatever I told you, transactions. And we know that people have learned on not providing banks the real information of the value of the households, particularly the wealthy people. So they undervalue the registry of their houses in order to diminish the amount of the transaction, and they can always pay abroad, find different ways of compensating the seller, and the buyers end up having a low tax base. So that's the new challenges, no? And how can we develop information on why those are unrealistic transactions, and how can you prove people that that is the case, has been one of the new challenges of the tax administration. So they are trying to collect information on the advertisements of the households in Colombia. When they are selling or renting a house, they usually put something in the window for people to know, particularly in the wealthy neighborhoods. So there is people going around. I do that myself, and we call, no? And we negotiate, no, for how much is that premise being sold, and we provide information in order to have more accurate information on the households that are more critical. But what we are beginning to learn is you have to have access to those international real estate companies, no, that really provide household for international employees that are moving across countries, and they really have the true information. And there is a lot of information in YouTube and those websites of people that like to show the really amazing house. So we have people watching that and trying to follow the realtors that present those premises abroad. You have to look outside. That information is rarely found domestically. So that is the new. So this gives you a picture of the city of Bogota, and those are all the transactions in a given year. So you have 2.5 million premises, and you have to come up with the valuation of those out of 100,779 transactions. And for that, you need strong models. We found at the end that the interpolation of some basic model, very basic linear Gauss econometrics, was the most reliable and the most useful. But we have this really complicated, sophisticated panels with distance and all kind of that, and they have some amazing names that Rahul can tell you about. We did all of that. They didn't work much, but that's just our case. And the reason is that where the models matter a lot is for the poor people's housing. And those transactions are very limited. It's a lot of people, but the movement of ownership is not significant. So it's very hard for you to get accurate data on that, and the value of the houses doesn't change as much. So there is not a need for these very complicated machines that look at distance, how close you are to the metro. Bogota doesn't have a metro. No, a mall, all of that doesn't exist. So those things don't really explain much in cities that are pretty much basic. Bogota is pretty much basic. So that's why we ended up with some basic interpolations. And we made, and this is critical, we made sure that you would never go above 60-70% of what the model tells you. The assessment has to have a significant margin of error. And you cannot appropriate the error on a tax base, because then people are going to be furious, because very likely you're going to be over the value of the household. So we made sure that in most cases, with certainty, would be below market value. That is at the expense of collecting, but having people mad at the system has such a huge cost that is not worthwhile. And President Petro tried to adjust that in some segments, and they even increased to a margin of error of 10%, and people are beginning to get pretty pissed off. And what the problem is, they're going to put a ceiling to the increase of the tax in the legislation. That is the natural response. They tell you property tax cannot increase more than inflation, and then you're screwed. And so that's what you have to watch for. Make sure that never happens. That is the risk now in Colombia. And knowing the city is fascinating from the point of view of where to spend your time. Most of the value in Bogota is in horizontal property in one specific area of the city, which is the one you can see on purple. The rest of the households are pretty much the same. It's based on the replacement value of the construction. There is nothing sophisticated about it. The kitchen doesn't matter, the bathroom doesn't matter. They're not add-ons because people are extremely poor or with very low middle income. And those are not the segments where you're going to capture money. The places that matter are those that are purple. And those require very specialized people that understand all the details of what people pay for. And these are the different valuation methods. So we have the econometric models is 42% of the city. 7%, and that's mostly commercial and industrial, at very specific appraisals. Like the big shopping malls, you have to have a specific appraisal for the shopping mall. And this was one of the big insights that saved the whole process, because the shopping malls were paying the media to really screw the whole process, because they didn't want the assessment to go on. So sitting with them and talking to them, we realized that we had made a huge mistake, because we believed that based on the percentage of the area of each of the tenants of the shopping mall, we could spread the tax among all of them. And that's not the case. It's extremely hard to know how people come up to an agreement how to pay for the common goods. And whatever they have agreed upon, that's what you have to use. And that took us a while. But fortunately, they're pretty good at listening. And just by listening, we realized that they had huge fights among the different tenants of the shopping mall. And the ones that had the huge premises would tell the ones with the small premises that people would walk through their premise because they were going to their shop. So they shouldn't pay for that area. See? And somehow they come up with a way of splitting the maintenance cost of the shopping. And whatever they have agreed upon, that's what you have to use. So when we managed to get that information, how they split all the common expenses, we were able to successfully implement the assessments. Because that was the way to spread the tax. There is no other way. Because to get each particular shop being valued in a shopping mall is impossible and it's insane. Because they are extremely different. The commercial ones that only sell food and it's just a window, and most of the space is just the kitchen, and they have a lot of customers coming and going, and they use the space of everybody else's because people are walking with the food around the mall. And the big Macy's where people walk around is, if you allow yourself to get into that debate, they crush you. So we were lucky that we understood they had a rule and we applied their rule. And that happens as well with some horizontal property. So those specific appraisals are quite relevant for you to deal with the different nature of the different premises. So this gives a result. So we improved the institution, the information is used for many different things now, and everything is being done virtually, and you can see the increase. No? It's like for, when I began, it was 765,000 million pesos. Now it's 4.4 billion. That is $1 billion. It is the highest collection in the cities in the region. And you can see only COVID, and that was a decision. They stopped the appraisal during COVID to make sure people didn't, by any chance, had to pay 1 penny more of what they were paying. It's the only year that you can see a little drop.
So you have $1 billion.
No, more than that. It's $1.1 billion.
Wow.
That we collect in the city.
That's 10 times what we collect in Lagos.
And as you can see, and I didn't put that, and that's my mistake, and that's my little baby. I came up with a formula, math, a logarithmic function, that you make sure that everybody's tax was going to be connected to the appraisal, but for the poor people, it was going to be extremely gradual. So it increases every year, but it increases for the amount their minimum wage is being increased. So I tied the increase of the tax to the minimum wage increase and not to the appraisal, and to the point that it converges to the appraisal. So when you see that continuity in the growth, is that convergence process. So everybody's tax has been growing for the last 10 years, a little bit every year. And for the very wealthy, I increase it immediately with no compassion. So how you the graduation of that process of how the appraisal becomes a tax, either up and down, because you have to be fair. Now, there are parts of the city that there is a crisis. If the appraisal comes down, the tax goes down immediately for the full amount. No, that's a part of fairness. But for all the people where the appraisal is higher than the tax base, it goes up until it catches up. And it can be 20 years for the very poor, but you make sure that it catches up at some point. No? So I make different curves for the different segments. Obviously, the very wealthy is immediate. It goes up and down on a yearly basis. There is no compassion. But then you start making it gradual by different segments. And we have like 4 or 5 segments that increases at different speeds. So some people will converge in 4 or 5 years, like middle class, very poor in 20 years, very wealthy next day. And that is what allowed for that continuous increase. You see, from 2009 to 2019, look how steady is the increase of collection. And that's because of the way we drafted the legislation on the appraisal being moved on into the tax base on a very gradual base. That is a really pretty, and even drew the curve in the legislation, and they put the formulas. People had never seen a law with so many logarithms in their lives. And they asked me to change that for numbers at the end because the logarithm became too challenging for many of them. But I had a lot of fun doing that. And this is how many people pay their tax. This is 2,431,000 people file for the taxes on time on a yearly basis. Only during COVID, there is a little increase. There is a huge, out of 2.5. There is a huge conscience of people, and people ask for their property tax. So that aspect of people getting the information on time, being able to pay online easily, having the information on their cell phone that your tax is due, please don't be late. We offer a discount of 10% if people pay early. All those little details really matter to keep people current. You don't want people to begin to realize that they can choose not to pay, because then it's a mess. So, and these are the mistakes. So that we really follow carefully the number of claims, no? And something that you have to make sure each of those are addressed and are addressed timely. These are the PQRs. Those are the people's concerns that the evaluation is wrong. And you cannot let those fester, because it becomes an infection. If people can go to the public and say you are doing it poorly, people are going to begin to doubt the whole system. So those are addressed very quickly. And you send people literally almost on a personal base to see what is going on, because for sure there is always issues that you have to resolve, and sometimes it's a surprise. Then look at the height, like if you go up and you look at height in Bogota, I don't know how it is in Nigeria, and there are some very specific houses. Look at the volume of the households. See, this is like 2.5 meters for everybody, but when you go to the penthouse, this thing is 6 meters. So it's not the square meters, it's the volume. And you have to have rules for that. And those are extremely different houses. And look at that. These are like on top of all the big buildings in Bogota, in the expensive neighborhoods, is like going to another world. I've been to some of those apartments and they are insane, like how different they are. But your people at the most can look at this. So how can you come up with means in which you get to understand how people in those apartments live? See? If people know that I'm saying this, they will never let me in, so I have to be careful. But these are the high-end properties. Look at this. This is like 1,000 square meters apartment. This is totally, all these people are pretty much the same, but then you come here and it's totally different story. And look at this one. This is one of the prettiest apartments in Bogota. If I ever were to be rich, which I would never be, that would be the one I would choose. This is absolutely amazing how it is done. And look at the size of the terraces and the windows. I didn't take pictures of the kitchens, they didn't allow me. But I like to cook. I've always been envious because they are impressive. So this is kind of like in my mind, the biggest question is how you make it fair. How you make, we know how to make most people pay, but we haven't been able to really make it progressive, because the high end really escapes the institution's capacity to be able to come up with realistic assessments, because it's out of this world. So this is the presentation. If you have any questions, I'm more than happy.
Thank you. So I actually have a couple of very quick questions, just mostly clarifications. So when you said that the tax is really on the building of the dwelling, so is that, I mean, in terms of the titles to the properties, is that necessary to have before they pay the tax, or is it like in some countries, you occupy, you pay?
In the case of Colombia, it's not about you occupy, you pay. Is if you don't pay, regardless who owns it and regardless who didn't pay, we can go for the property. The property is the subject of the tax, not the individual that enjoys the property. I don't care about who owns it and who's living there. If the property is due, the property will respond with itself for the tax that is being owed.
Exactly.
So whenever someone is buying a premise, they really make sure to know that all the taxes have been paid in time before the transaction is being carried out. And it becomes something lawyers really check. Like Have you checked there is no you paying taxes? Because if not, you are going to be the one paying for them once you find the profit. So that's why the subject of the tax is the property,
I think
not the
that's-
individual.
That's a really important legal sort of point. When you said that there's automatic updating, so is there like a system of suppose I do a modification of my property, I need to get a permit, and is that then automatically?
And if there is an increase of square meters, it goes to the base. If it's a change of the kitchen, it should go to the base. No, everything that requires permit, but people are very good at not letting you know they've done that. When people modify the bathroom and kitchens, they usually avoid providing that information, and it's being done without the permits. And so being able to gather that information, it's very challenging. And there is a lot of money on that. So you have to begin going after the architects that provide the service and getting information from tax administration on the architect's income because they provide that. So you begin asking them to provide information on the premises they've received the contract to modify and to provide. So you have to find ways to cross data from different sources. Otherwise, people will begin to undermine the tax base.
Excellent.
Yes, I've got
Yeah, sure. Go ahead.
So this is extremely useful. So thank you
No,
very
my
much.
pleasure.
I find your experience is almost like you're talking about Lagos, but not where we are now. Essentially where we could be in another few years. So thank you so
We
very
did
much.
this in 6 months.
6 months. So my 3 years is
So-
realistic, right?
This can be done pretty quickly
Awesome.
if you bet on it. And it makes so much money that the quicker the better. You can do it quickly. You just need to have the right people on top of it.
Yeah.
Because the data is really at your fingers. And they don't expect that. They don't expect you to begin looking at that information. And it's all there. Like what the web, I had one top statistician, really top, extremely smart, and one architect that knew a lot about design and value, and they got really top computers. Those two guys put together the database in 2-3 months.
Your cost is really very low.
Yeah.
The cost of doing this for you
No,
is so
the rate of return is huge,
Wow.
huge.
So I have 2 questions,
Yeah.
quick ones. So quite impressive that you're able to collect around 1 point something billion from value of 178. So that's, I think it's
That's what we say. We should go for 1%. That's what he said.
Close to it's 0.7, 0.8, right?
Yeah.
So, but what I want to find out from you is you also made a comment about the poor guys really are not paying a lot, but you think they should pay something as part of participation in governance. So, are you able to estimate what percentage of your collection is coming from the rich guys?
Oh, yeah.
Versus, yes.
Yeah, I have all that in detail. That is like in all societies, the big bulk is the middle class because there are too many. No? And middle class begins with something that here would be almost being poor. No? Because the middle class in countries like Colombia, it is a yearly income of $20,000. That's pretty low. Yeah. So when you look at the segment of people that carries the burden, is the middle class. But those are not the complicated assessments. What you have to make sure is the very wealthy, which are very few, carry something like a 15%. No? And that's when the whole thing begins to coalesce because they see these very wealthy people that are 6,000 premises, because it's not more than that, they pay a huge share percentage-wise. And as long as you do that, the middle class goes on. We are a little bit envious. So say, okay, I pay, but at least they pay 10 times more than I do. No, that works.
Yeah, okay. So then the second one is, if you need to enforce, I see the compliance rate is quite high, which is good. But if you need to enforce, I hear you about, you put there about something expropriation. So is that really to scare them so they can pay? Or do you actually go ahead and enforce and expropriate?
I do both. You
Okay.
cannot scare people if you don't act upon it. No,
Yeah.
for some reason, I'm somehow a little bit scary, which I don't like, but that's the way it is. Like when I go in the media, people get scared. So that worked. No? It's not good for my popularity, but from the point of view of tax collection, has always been very useful. People have to understand that you are going to follow through, regardless who they are, and that's why you have to pick your fights. No? And literally, this is not nice, but I would literally pick my fight. I would choose someone that would never be seen as weak, or someone that is you are being abusive, or you're using the strength of the state against someone that is unprotected. So you would choose someone that most people would feel they are not fulfilling their obligation in society.
And you get the political support.
That's always been the risk. No, but I'm not a politician at all, as you can see. But I would always tell the politicians, well, if you hire me, I'm an acquired flavor. So you have to make sure you know what you are getting yourself into.
Yeah.
I have that very transparent conversation. And I tell them, from a political point of view, for you to have a good source of income that is reliable would let you have much more room for maneuvering than trying to protect people from 5-6 fights that I will pick, because I will pick them. But I won't pick the ones that will be a pain in the butt for you. I will just pick ones that we can swallow. No, I won't go after the former president who is not paying his taxes, because that would be a political disaster. So that's why choosing and picking your fights really, really matters. So someone who is wealthy, who is not treating well its employees, that deals with some contraband, that spends a lot of money and is very luxurious, but is not paying his taxes. No, that's the chosen. Yeah.
I was laughing because you can think of many Nigerian examples.
And the process for the enforcement, do you have like a land tribunal? Do you go through the court process?
No, we go through the court process.
How long does it take on the average?
Not that long. Not that long, because taxes have kind of like a very clear legislation that whoever owns it, and given that the property is the one responsible, the property is not very good at defending itself. So I just show the property, show the taxes haven't been paid. I'm not making it about you. I make it about the property. No? And it's everything. That's why I told you we choose the day, people around, a place that is visible. No, if you in Colombia, there is always a square, there is a church. So when people are going to mass at 12, one of the big shops in the middle of it, and you send people with the uniforms and the big picture that says this property is being taken over for not paying its taxes. You never mention who is responsible. You go for the property. But everybody knows, and everybody has to see it. No? Or you provide an interview in front of a premise that is well known. It's something. It's pure choreography.
Yeah.
That is something that I was very careful thinking about how, when it's totally premeditated. That is not something out of like chance. And you allow some amount that is being done in order to make it regular, but trying to be soft. The hard hand at the end can be extremely costly. So you have to be very careful. As I said, you don't want to get people that are under duress. No? They've been fired. They have 7 children. You have to be extremely humane.
Yeah.
So that's why I pick the fights. So to make sure I don't pick the wrong.
Yeah. Thank you.
No, it was not. Something else? No?
I uploaded yours.
Sorry?
Yours is uploaded in.
Yeah, the typos as well.
I have.
But see, otherwise I have the.
I don't think I received it, so maybe.
Yeah, it's not uploaded.
Okay, can you connect my laptop?
No, you have to put on USB stick.
Yeah, I'll just connect mine.
Okay.
Put on this website. Into your computer.
Well, just connect this to keyboard, yeah, it's easiest. Okay, so let's move on to, thanks a lot, huh? Juan Ricardo, fantastic.
No.
Really, really,
Yeah.
very explicit. So we'll move on to hearing from Taiwo about the Nigerian experience. And then I can, after that, go straight to Zambia. And then we'll wrap up.
Yeah, thanks a lot. I think after listening to my friend, I feel like I got everything I wanted. So, but I'll share the experience for Nigeria. At least it gives the context as to where we are and what else we have to do. So I'm from the policy side, so I'm more interested in the policy side, but also the rest of the journey as a whole. So historically, we've had different structures of ownership, from families to traditional rulers, and then sometimes in the 80s, 90s, I believe it was, a law was enacted putting the ownership rights on the governors for the states for the bulk of the land, maybe 90% of it. So the rest of it is federal government and a few freeholds. So we still have till today a mixture of customs and practice as well as the law. So for example, you have traditional rulers who collect informal taxes, even as of today, properties. And the way they collect it, they're even more effective than the government because they use violence in collecting it. If you don't pay, they can demolish your development. They send touts and so they're really very aggressive, and the state just looks the other way while they do that. We also have a very complex and costly process for getting titles. I think that the system is intentionally made complex so that some people can make money under the table through corruption. And we estimated that the value of debt capital from real estate is around $900 billion for the whole of the country. Seeing the number for Bogota, I think we should even increase that because it means that Lagos, by our estimation, will be under 100 billion. I think it should not be less than Bogota. Yeah,
Sure.
we've got properties of $6, $7, $8, $10 million, like Banana Island. Yeah. Then there's a lot of illicit wealth is put into property in Nigeria. The good thing about that is those guys, because they don't want to be exposed, you can actually make them pay tax, because they know if you begin to investigate them, it will go beyond tax. It will be a question of where did they get the money from. So the policy framework is what we're working on currently, and that is we're very particular about equity. So I like that you've thought about that, and you've also been able to share your experience as to what's working, what's not working. The previous governor of Lagos State, about 4 or 5 years ago, made a very huge mistake because he introduced a new land use charge and did not consider equity and fairness. And it really backfired. I think it's one of the major reasons he lost his re-election because he was trying to tax everybody and had not really thought about the impact on the poorest people. So that we were up in arms. You'd be surprised that some of them are to pay less than $20, but that's a big deal for them. And the big guys who could pay a lot of money felt they were embarrassing the kind of amount they were being asked to pay. Some of them are being asked to pay annual rates that's barely what you need for a meal at a 5-star hotel for a whole year. Guys with millions of dollars of property. So we're looking at it being progressive. One other thing we're taking into account in terms of fairness and equity is we think we have to look at it beyond the taxes that we ask them to pay. We have to look at the spending for amenities and services that government is providing. The overall formula being that in a poor neighborhood, the amount of taxes we collect from them should be less than the amount that government is spending back in that community. So from the spending side, we see it as being progressive if you're applying that formula as well. We also think that it's important to design the system to drive the right behaviors and outcome. On one hand, by the taxpayer, and on the other hand, by the government. So it used to be the case that if your property was not registered and it has no title, you didn't pay the tax. So the question was, why should I be in a hurry to register my property if registering means I have to pay taxes? So a few years ago, that was changed. So everybody has to pay now, whether there's title or not. So we think that will drive the right behavior from the government, from the taxpayer side. But we also think that from the government side, because sometimes it just makes the process of getting title very complicated. So we think there should be a disincentive to the government, such that if my property has no title in Nigeria, then it's of less value. So government should reflect that in the taxes that they collect. So they collect less from me, the same property, if I have no title and you do have title. So we're still working out the details for that.
If I may,
yes, please.
In the poor neighborhoods, that became very critical because people knew, because of the way property rights work in Colombia, if you can show you've been occupying that premise and you've been paying the taxes for 5 years, then you have the right to the title. So tying up the paying of the tax to legislation that recognizes property, regardless of the history and the tradition of the premise, really made the difference. Particularly,
that's in your law, right? Yeah, that's a good idea.
That's
a good idea. 80%, the new area in Lagos is called Lekki. And just about 2 weeks ago, the government said 80% of property there have no titles. 80%.
Yeah. And
so that's because many of them can't find anything to make sense.
They will value that document that says, I pay the tax as their title.
For 5 years. Yeah, I think it's a good one. Okay. Thanks. We'll take that into account in what we're doing. The other one from the policy dimension is to try and look at this whole thing about property tax from a different perspective that says it's actually an investment you're making. So you pay, because today we have a lot of what I call implicit tax, property tax in Nigeria, where people would contribute to buy the road, buy sanitation, street lights. So the stuff that you would do, that you expect the municipality and the state to do with property tax money, people actually doing it for themselves. But of course, they are less effective in doing that. So we're thinking we could develop a narrative that says you pay this to the government, then government provides in return the amenities. So that's more like then your tax becomes an investment in your property, because the value will then also go up if there's road and there's so many other things. For those who then rent, if it's a rental property, you get more from the rent. Almost the rent refinancing the taxes you have to pay. So there are broader issues around land governance. Some of it is you have policies around land that is disconnected completely from the economic goals. So we're trying to get our people to see how do you align both. If you have an objective to try and develop, sometimes it's agric. You want agriculture to be developed. You want, as a factor of production, you want land to not be an impediment to people wanting to grow different things. People buying property, not developing it, and just holding it for speculation for so long. So we're trying to see how do we balance all of that so that there's an alignment between the land policy and economic goals. So the cadastre, it's with the help of the World Bank. That is, I think there's some development to a point where it can now be utilized for different things. Having information around ownership be used, and then using that data for economic planning. We're working on an address system which we think is also another important factor that should go into land governance. And there are issues around climate change and sustainability. We're having a conversation with the governor of Lagos State and his team around developing a framework for redevelopment. So we have areas, prime areas with, very low quality properties that were developed 40, 50 years ago. And now the whole place is developed, but the quality of the property is nothing to write home about. And there are private sector guys who say, well, I have the resources. I'll give these guys a new property for free, right?
Yeah.
Maybe I just need to do some high rise from, one floor and use the rest to develop. And we're saying to Lagos State, you could also use that as an opportunity. Part of the condition for the redevelopment rights could be that you must provide public infrastructure. Maybe that's a bus stop, maybe something to link with the metro, recycling, so on and so forth. And then one area where we struggle with, and I was very pleased to hear your experience, is around dispute prevention and resolution. This takes forever in Nigeria.
Yeah.
It can take as long as 10 years, which doesn't benefit anyone, not the government, not the people. So one of the interventions we are thinking about is having a land tribunal. Maybe that will fast track it. I don't think we have sufficient expectation that the regular court system will behave differently anytime soon. So we just need to be realistic. And what we found from one of the states is that just the threat of a legal case in itself changes behavior significantly. About 90% of people who were defaulting in payments paid up as soon as they were served with a notice to say, we're going to take you to court. They just don't want.
Yeah.
And sometimes the amount you're asking them to pay is so small, not even enough to cover their cost of dealing with the court process. So finally, around the property tax reform, the amount we collect currently is quite low, less than 0.3% of GDP. Our target is to get that to 1% within the next 2 to 3 years. Again, good to hear that even in 6 months we can move the needle. Then there are issues around capacity of the government to collect. Of course, a lot of issues around valuation. So the valuation today it's quite embarrassing, really. So every time I see we use annual value, rateable value. When I see the value from a property, I just feel like government is wasting everybody's time. It's so ridiculously low. And I think in the past 5 years, I've only received assessment twice. So even someone like me that is willing to pay, I don't get the assessment. So one of the things we are planning to do is to say, is there a way that first government can automate the process for assessments, going for simplicity over being scientifically correct. So maybe something that is simple. And then on top of that, request some level of self-assessment where I have to fill something to show the features of my property and all of that. And then with a warning that says you can be selected for an audit. So on one hand, you have an automated way of valuation. The second layer is individual self-assessment with the real threat that you can be selected for an audit, and therefore you're careful not to significantly understate the value of your property. You will not be the one to say the value, you'll be the one to say the features, and the system will estimate the value, including, for example, rental income ratio, because we have that a lot in Lagos in particular. And on the personal income tax side, we're thinking of introducing a requirement to grant a tax deduction for rent paid, so that the tenants, we have a motivation to disclose the rent that they have paid, because they're going to get a deduction. Today, we just give free allowances. We want to change that to deductions that are based on rental and maybe a few other things. So I have no motivation to disclose my rent because I need to get deduction for it. Yeah. But the system picks that up and uses it as one of the bases to do valuation. One, we have withholding tax on rent, which we're going to collect. Yeah. And then second, we then do ratio rental income to see the property value. And that's also the thing the point I made about the handshake between other taxes and also between the federal government. They have more data between the federal government and the states and the municipal government, just to make sure that it's more intelligent to at least estimate when you think that someone is trying to underdeclare or avoid the payment or evade the taxes. We also have the similar experience as yours, where you can pay a bribe to influence the assessment. But that's also because you have a lot of human interaction. If you automate it, then that risk is significantly less than we currently have. So overall, our objective, at least from the policy side, is how do you develop a sustainable land administration system for shared prosperity. So we're trying to make the final outcome about the people. So this is not government trying to generate revenue, because what's the whole essence of revenue if not to take care of the people and improve their quality of life and well-being? So that's the journey. Interestingly, I was supposed to have a meeting with the governors yesterday, and I was glad that they said they want a physical meeting. So because I would have said whatever I said yesterday without the experience today. So now I have better information to meet with them in June. So thank you, Radu. Thank you, everyone. This is really
Thank you.
nice.
Thank you, Pedro.
If I may make 2 comments.
Yeah, please.
Do you have capital tax? Capital
Yes.
gains tax?
Yes.
On the self-assessments, the threat of an audit is something that I'm very cautious on, because auditors have the worst incentive when they walk into an audit, so they can always be convinced not to audit you, because there is value at the table immediately. So I'm unless you have really strong corruption controls, audit is something that you talk about, but you just do very carefully. At least that's in my experience. So what we did on the self-assessment is we allowed them to use self-assessment in order to deal with the capital gains tax. So if people wanted to estimate the value of the capital gains tax, they needed to use their last property tax base against the market price. So when people foresee that they are going to be selling, they self-assess on their own. And that information is extremely useful, because you can see before the transaction happens that there is a change in value. So we use self-assessments on that regard, not for people to bring down the value with the threat of an audit. I don't think we have much room for people to lower the value unless they go through the process of a request for assessment correction. And you cannot self-assess down, but you can always assess up. But for that incentive to occur, you have to link it with the capital gain tax. And rural properties is something that I didn't spoke about. I believe property taxation of rural properties is a totally different ballgame. And I've been trying to learn for already 10 years and trying to read what they do in different places. And it's something that still is beyond me, because the heterogeneity of economic activity in similar land holds and the movement of prices. Sometimes the milk is doing well, then the strawberries, then the flowers. So you cannot do the taxation based on the prosperity of each of the activities on a timely base. So what I've seen that I believe is the most useful is being very cautious on everybody that is exploiting the land, having a pretty low tax for everybody. And if they sell the premise for a change of activity, then at the value of the sale price, collect 5 to 10 years back, no? Because you want to protect the agricultural activity in premises close to the cities. You don't want to bring everything to urban areas because it makes more sense. So we were careful on doing that and making sure that it's a significant burden when you're going to have the income, because we were just paying a huge amount by selling your land to change the use of it. And on land that is not being exploited. If the land has no economic activity, it's been store of value. In Colombia, happens a lot with the drug dealers. So you make sure that those lands pay. But for the rest, agriculture is, in my mind, impossible to address models, because the changes in prices is way too volatile for any tax system to deal with it. Yeah. That's my, I don't know if you agree with me. Like,
I do agree with you.
I've been trying to learn this, and this is beyond me.
Well, I think it's a very good point, and I think in our work we try to focus a lot just on the urban properties, and when it comes to property tax as such, and rural lands and rural, because as you said, I mean, what do you do with fallow land? What do you do with land that's public land which is being used by pastures for grazing? And what do you? I mean, there's so many different. So it's very difficult to come up with any model that deals with every aspect of rural properties and rural lands. So, but in Zambia, which is one example that I'll quickly cover in a minute, they don't have any differences. So all the councils, the local government councils, it's the same instruments, the same tax rates on all properties, and that doesn't make any sense.
Yeah.
If you got a big farm and then you've got a little shack there where the farmer probably spends some time and maybe some nights, but that can't have the same.
That's a very lazy.
Anyway, so we'll come to that. But any other questions for Taiwo or any comments?
This is a fun journey.
Yeah.
So let me go on to very quickly to cover a few interesting aspects of what we are trying to do in Zambia, and it's very different in many ways. But again, why it's different. So I always say that in many of these areas that we work in, the problems are pretty similar, but the solutions tend to be very different from country to country. I think that's what we have here. So I have a number of slides, but I'm going to go very quickly. I think one of the key things that we are finding to be a problem in terms of being able to implement a property tax in a sensible way in Zambia is that you can only tax those properties which are registered and titled, right? So this is why I was asking specifically, and this creates so many issues. And of course, we had a presentation in the morning as well today. As well as that day, we discussed cadastre first versus property tax first regimes, because if you are restricting yourself, legally restricting yourself from, then it's a double jeopardy.
Yeah.
So that's definitely something that's a big problem. And there are problems in Zambia. Again, this links to the whole issue of corruption. There are lots of copper mines and mine-owned properties, especially in the north. And they come up, so the municipal council, the city councils can negotiate poundages or grants in lieu of rates with those companies and with those property owners. Obviously, right? These are not. There's no systematic basis. They are not objective. So there's a lot of discretion here, which is always very bad from the corruption point of view. And then there's remission and hardship relief. Now, this was basically in the law for, old, like you mentioned, the athlete who became parent. This is not for copper mines, right? So, but those kinds of things are also there. So that's a big problem. The concept of market value is not well defined in the law. So you can say that we want the property to be close to or near market value or at market value, but if you don't define it well, then this is a problem. And then there's other, the typical problem of non-inflation indexed charges and fees. So you have a large number of these charges and fees, which are just nuisance value because there's hardly any revenue and they haven't been indexed. So they continue to be very small. So those are some of the key policy issues in Zambia. And then, of course, we are looking at what amendments can be made to the Ratings Act, which is their property tax law. One is that enable rates to be levied and collected, that concept of owner or occupier. And there are for example, in my home country, in India, many cities, states have this legislation that basically says, it's like it's taxes on the property. Whoever is occupying it, whoever's there, you pay. If you don't pay, then they have the power to take the property away. And then they are not So all of these remissions and these other means that they're using, they're not quantifying the revenue losses. So there's no way of knowing what you're losing out on. So that's obviously a huge problem. So we've suggested a creation of the Office of Value in General that can set uniform valuation standards. Now, this is where I thought this whole discussion, Juan Ricardo, on the highly valuable, highly luxurious properties, that's a very interesting aspect. And I think in so many, if you go, I mean, of course, Lagos is an outstanding example of that kind of, you've got the whole Banana Island, which is an exclusive domain. But so many cities around the world, which are so-called, poor country cities, or you see that there will be a number of properties and houses, commercial buildings, which are exceptionally luxurious. And any model will fail. You're right. So that's where I think a lot of us, this was a very interesting thing we need to think about. That. The same thing holds for a place like Lusaka. Now, on the admin side, this is where I think in Zambia, what we found is they're not being able to use technology. They have not been able to use technology. So this is a big gap, and that's why, I mean, I don't understand why. It's a country where they have a department of government called Smart Zambia that's working on, all kinds of rollouts of technology. They have a very good telecom sector that's working very well. So why in government they're not using? I have some pictures I'll show you. I mean, they're using these paper registers and things. So again, lack of automation. They're not using, automatic payment methods. There's a whole issue with the government and valuation and property management department, the processes. That it takes years and years. They're not being able to update the valuations. The cost of creating a valuation rule is very high. Valuation cycles are basically, there's no real proper regularity. So all of these things, which I found very interesting in Bogota, because you use technology. So obviously we know what are the benefits of using technology. I'm not going to spend too much time on this presentation. We can get into a discussion, but I wanted to show some of this is of course the issue of connectivity. But these are the kinds of, things they're using for these hard copy maps. In many of the, what are you going to do with this? There's nothing you can do.
Yeah.
I mean,
You can use your cell phone nowadays and make that into an automatic file. Have you seen that? You can do it with your hands in minutes.
yeah, you can do that, but I'm saying that, so these are some of the kinds of,
That is because of corruption. That's the same. When I ran the tax administration, the payroll, almost 11,000 employees, was done manually. And it was pretty clear because that would allow for them to create auditors that did not exist, but that would file, the key contraband cases, and nobody would be killed nor investigated because they didn't exist. But you would get the filings by those non-existent employees. And being the payroll manual, it was almost impossible to audit.
11,000.
11,000, yeah, that's the tax administration. Because then after doing the cadastre, I went into the tax administration of Colombia. And then they asked me to leave the country for like 7 years. that wasn't as successful.
No, but in Nigeria, I remember when we were trying to do working with the civil service, the head of service. One of the big things that she wanted us to focus on was to clean the database of federal employees. Yeah. So many ghost workers. Yeah, it's computerized. Fine, but there's so many ghost workers in there. And they keep on collecting salaries. Nobody knows who's collecting the salaries.
Yeah.
So this is the big problem we're trying to solve now in Ethiopia. They have 2.5 or some million civil servants on the whole in the country. There's no clear database. So it's all you ask anyone, two people, everybody will give you a different number for the number of employees. And obviously this is the coverage is really low. So I mentioned the fact that unregistered properties are not taxable. But there are also registered and numbered properties and they're also not recorded in the valuation rolls. So that's the second. So there's a huge gap. And then if we looked at this, we just made some estimate based on the 2022 census. So these are the estimated city council populations in the second column. Look at Lusaka, so 2.2 million. This is the provisional household average. So the estimated number of properties, residential, 489, 791. The properties that are in the latest valuation roll is 76,000. I mean, this is, so those, I mean, obviously there will be many very poor, let's say shacks, etc. in this 40, in this 400, but there are still, properties that should be on the tax roll that are not. Huge numbers of divergence, if you see, all over. So there is a big gap in Zambia, and obviously you can imagine the potential there just by bringing coverage in. And in the morning, you were here when the presentation on India. So one of the things that the local governments managed to do well in the last 4 or 5 years when they got that incentive from the federal government is they improved their coverage. And that's an immediate gain. So we are just looking at this and we're saying, well, guys, look, Lusaka itself, you can simply by improving your coverage by, from 76,000 to
so maybe 1.2 million or something.
you're going to be really increasing your. So I think there's a lot of slides here that are basically showing different pictures and how spatial data can be used and is being used in some like there are some successes in Luanshya and Chongwei. They are digitizing their properties. Now this is this kind of stuff has already happened in Nigeria. That's what I was, in these so many cities across the country, the smart mapping has happened. They even did the physical inspections of getting the data of the properties. So all of this has happened. So now the next step is of implementing the policy and the means to collect. Valuation data management and so on. These are all important things. How do you name? I'm sure there's a lot of this experience that Bogota has that can be shared. So I'm just basically going to stop here. I don't want to keep going on this because there are certain issues that I just wanted to highlight on the issues of policy and then admin. But essentially, to me, the two main things that are really important in this and where we find tremendous difficulties in developing country contexts. One is, of course, the policy and legal environment. So I think this whole thing about what we saw in Zambia, we're seeing in some other countries, this we have to get rid of. So this is one basic impediment. And I think the Bogota example of just focusing on the property, that's your tax base, that's your taxable entity. Focusing on that, I think, is a really good idea. And the idea of allowing someone to get a title if they occupy for 5 years or something like that, that's really good. So there's an incentive to pay rather than here, there's no incentive to get a title. Because when you get a title, now you have to pay tax. The other way around. So this obviously doesn't make any sense. The other is, I think, the criticality of technology. For this particular, I mean, maybe for income tax is still useful, but you can still do it without. Property taxation, you cannot successfully implement this at a reasonable cost without using technology in a big way. I mean, the kind of growth that is happening in cities around the world. And again, in the India presentation, there was an interesting slide where she showed that the value of properties, she was comparing with some Indian cities like Mumbai, Delhi, Bengaluru with Singapore, Johannesburg, New York, etc. Yeah, New York is, okay, maybe New York is much higher than some of those, but very comparable across Kuala Lumpur to, Mumbai to this, so now so the tax base is pretty much the same. And I'm sure, and you meant, I mean, Lagos, we know how some of those properties are like super expensive.
Yeah.
So there is the tax base exists. All we need to do is deploy the technology sensibly. And then I think some of the ideas that came out of I think this is the whole assessment of luxury properties. Those kinds of things I think are really, really very, very important. And I think those are the issues that we need to focus on as we work on the developing country context. So I'm going to stop here. I don't know if there's any other comments or questions. Thea is here as well.
Yeah, so I do have a comment. So one interesting fact about Zambia that I found out myself about 2 years ago. I was invited for this African Tax Administration Forum meeting.
Yeah.
And I learned from the head of the revenue service that 75% of the tax revenue is accounted for by five taxpayers in Zambia. So in fact, I made a joke that they should create a branch of the Internal Revenue Service in each of those 5 companies. Anyway, so the question I have for you is, based on your experience there in Zambia, do you think there's a political will to solve this problem? I think theirs is almost even more difficult than Lagos. But at least we have the register now, and there's a willingness. The governor was very excited with what we proposed. So where do you, in terms of that journey?
So in Zambia, there is actually a political momentum which is developing around the decentralization agenda. So it's not a federal country. It's basically one, country, and then you have these 20 councils, 20 urban councils, and another 100 or 90 something rural councils. So that's the way it works. So but they realize that you cannot now continue to work in that fashion without strengthening the local councils. So this decentralization is a big agenda of this new president got elected, I think, a year and a half ago. So that is what we are trying to ride on. That if you want to, implement the decentralization, you got to strengthen the local councils. And there's only one way to do that, which is to allow them to strengthen them so they can collect more own those revenues. So that's the advantage. The other advantage that we have in Zambia is we have an existing World Bank operation called the Zambia Devolution Support Project. It's $210 million, which has been sitting there, not being very successful. So what we're trying to do is restructure that project now to focus it a little bit more on being able to strengthen these local banks.
Something
And you something like that.
Yeah.
That's what we want to do.
Yeah. That was very successful.
Replicate the systems.
Of course, it also needs a lot what you are saying is you need also a vision on how do the first steps, how to break that with the economy and get this. And of course, that is being smart and knowing a little bit like, okay, if you touch here, this is going to happen here, if you touch here, it bites you.
Right?
Yeah.
So without that, and also the World Bank can do it, because sometimes it's also a play, but you need to be consistent. Like you're saying, like if you say yes, I'm going to do it, you have to do that. Otherwise it will not. So it is, and if you know you will not do it, then better not even try. So it's because you lose your any credibility, or you will not succeed the next time because they know you will not implement. So it's a bit, I think it's in a way, what should be done is clear everywhere, but where to start, and also what would then open up the next step a bit. Like if you start doing it here, it will be easy to go there. But I can't say it for you. I think it's almost like we know technically what should be done, but then how would you approach it? Or politically is maybe a strong word, but strategically, it's that seems to be the issue. Yeah.
So thank you very much. Thanks for coming.
Thank you very much. Very, very useful. So thank you a lot.
Whatever.